Thank you very much for having me today. I won't call out all the groups, but I really appreciate the universities, the community colleges. Great to see Kay Hagan here and all the other elected officials and friends from my time in the State Senate. Yes, I served 4 years, from '05 to '09. So this is the time of year that people make New Year's resolutions. Of course, now we're 2 weeks into it. This is the time of year you might have already broken them. I was talking to a friend in the coffee shop the other day as we were drinking coffee, and he said his New Year's resolution was not to come to the coffee shop and drink coffee every morning. So how is that working out for you? I think, I've noticed that it's just easier for some of us, for some people, to take bold steps, to try something new, to commit to some new adventure, and to stay with it. And for others, it is just harder. And I will say, over the last 2 years as treasurer, I've noticed this too, just as a manager, that sometimes you see a really talented person, they've got a lot to offer, and you give them some new bold challenge, or you make them a job offer. And even though in their heart of hearts they know this is a great opportunity, they can't do it. They just say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. And it makes me a little sad, because you know that that person is talented and that their career is going to be maybe a little more limited and their impact maybe not so much. Well, that failure to act is not just limited to individuals, but it can be collective. And in this state, I think there is a prime example of a failure to act in past years, and that is tax reform. Fun topic. So I'm going to see if I can work this thing out. My little New Year's resolution slide. So over the last 2 decades, there has been, to my count, about 7 different commissions on tax reform. And this year, it hasn't had as much attention maybe so far because, as many of the legislators in the room know, the budget deficit that's looming for the state of North Carolina, which is $3.5 billion, more or less, and at that number, is huge. And it's taking a lot of the oxygen out of the room. And I care about that budget deficit as much as anyone as treasurer. But I also, as the manager of the pension for this state, as the manager for all the state debt, have an innately sort of long-term perspective on finances. And I believe that tax reform is critical to our economic prosperity and financial stability here in North Carolina. So I also think that there's actually a connection between the budget deficit that we're facing, this $3.5 billion, and the failure of all of us to enact tax reform in the past. And that's because our tax system has gotten onto a narrower and narrower base, and it is a very volatile revenue stream. And so I actually live next to the state fairground in Raleigh, and I love going to the fair every year. I like riding the rides. I do not want to ride a tax revenue roller coaster, which is what we are all on today. So that is what is prompting some of this. And this is, you can see the revenue drop off there. And the good news is, slowly we will be growing out of this, but this year's public budgets, and this, of course, is the mayor, and again, this is going to be a really rough year. So the other thing that happens is not only the volatility of our tax system, which is causing a lot of bad choices right now, but that we have to keep increasing our rates, because as the base shrinks, you have to up the tax rate. And this slide, we started with a 3% state sales tax in the 1930s during the Great Depression. We stayed at 3% through 1991 in that recession. This shows us at 4.5, but it's actually gone as high as 5.75%. So we've had to double that sales tax almost in the last 20 years just to keep the revenue stable, because we only tax products, goods, we don't tax any services, and as that part of our economy shrinks, and even today we're talking about the military, we're talking about biotech, a lot of those it's not necessarily manufacturing. So that is a problem. The third reason why I think tax reform is important is, when you have a budget deficit like we do, and you say, let's look at every dime that we are spending in our budget. And we always think about the appropriation side. Let's make sure we're not wasting any money in how we allocate our budget. But we don't think about the revenue side. And all of the tax credits and exemptions is just spending by another name. And I think we need to look at all of those as well. This is my proposal deals with the three major taxes that support the revenue in the state. You can see here personal income tax, sales tax, corporate income tax actually shrunk a lot over the past decades. My goal would be to broaden and then lower those three tax rates and a target reduction of 1% in the rate. So for the first one, for the personal income tax, it would just be starting with adjusted gross income, and I'm not going to get into a tech junkie speech here on what is all this defined, but the basic concept is you would still deduct your mortgages, and you would still deduct your charitable deductions, you would cap that, and this is very similar, we've already mentioned Erskine-Bowles today, very similar to what Erskine proposed at the federal level, and then try to reduce all these taxes and credits. And I'm just as guilty. When I was a state senator, I filed tax credit bills, you know, and it's like they're all nice to have. Do you get a tax credit for recycling oyster shells? Yes, you could get, you know, I mean, but it's how many average people really understand and know and utilize those tax credits? It ends up being the folks that have the expensive accountants or the fleet of lawyers. So if we could simplify all that, you could lower the personal income tax rate by 1%. And right now it's about 6, 7, and 7.75, so you can come down to a 5% for the low end rate. On the sales tax side, and this just shows you there, again, the rates. On the sales tax, we tax about 35 different services. And we are that's a lot lower. Most states that have a sales tax, including, I mean, conservative, you know, not wild and crazy states, like Tennessee to our west, they tax about 55 services. And the difference is they include personal, I've got the slide on this, entertainment, repairs and storage, property services, and personal care. So they just, it's a set of about 5 different categories. That would allow us to broaden and stabilize that roller coaster and lower the rate by 1%. This is very similar. Again, there's been a lot of different commissions. The state Senate proposed this last year. And finally, on the corporate side, that's the corporate tax rate. And again, you know, sometimes you think, well, as we have to keep raising our rates, it makes us less competitive. So if we could lower that, you could, again, start with a combined reporting and then try to eliminate some of the taxes and exemptions and make it more simple tax code and then lower the rate. So before you start circling the wagons, I was at an Aspen Institute seminar recently, and there was a bunch of elected officials, and they said, you know, to solve big problems, everybody can't stand there with their boxing gloves in each corner and defend their position, that you have to all move a little bit towards the middle. And that means as an elected official or as a business leader or what have you, that this was this man's, the professor's, leadership is about disappointing your constituents at a rate they can absorb, which is an unusual, maybe, leadership definition. But I think when it comes to tax reform, it's relevant because no one really wants to talk about this or change. But again, why do I think that this year could be different? I think it could be different because of this pain and the bad choices we are faced with this year for the budget. And I hope that no other governor and no other General Assembly is faced with the set of choices that we are faced with this year. And to avoid that, to prevent that from ever happening, tax reform, even if it is revenue neutral, and that's the assumption here, is that this is not some cheap little sneaky way to raise everybody's taxes. But even if you just say this is revenue neutral, this is not going to solve the budget deficit necessarily this year, but for the longer term, it puts us on a much better growth trajectory, more competitive for business, more predictable for business, and certainly more predictable for families who right now are wondering about what services are they going to get, what's going to happen as we face this budget deficit. And I would go so far to say, and I've said this in Raleigh and in other forums, that if we don't pass tax reform this year, then this session will be a failure. It is that important. And I say this too, as treasurer, you might say, well, why are you speaking out on this? Again, I am responsible not only for the pension and the debt, but for the financial stability of the state. I interface with the bond rating agencies. They have said to me they are the most concerned about North Carolina, which has so many strong points. But our tax system is so archaic and outdated and volatile. That is our number one threat to our bond rating. So I do feel it's important. And so my pledge to you, coming back to those New Year's resolutions, is to be a leader on this issue. I am talking to legislators, legislative leaders, other thought leaders on this issue, and I will continue to make this, use the influence of the Office of State Treasurer as a financial leader of the state, and engage with other folks on this. And then I hope for all of you that as we come back to those individuals who, when offered some new opportunity, some change, that you will be, we collectively will embrace that, do what we know in our heart of hearts we need to do, and do this important step for the stability of the state and our future economic prosperity. Thank you very much for having me today.